So I was in this major corporate review last week, watching a presentation. And the woman leading it, honestly, she was brilliant, really sharp, totally data-driven, knew her stuff inside out. She's maybe 3 slides in, explaining this pretty complex market analysis. And then this male executive from a totally different department he just starts talking.
Okay.
Not asking a question or anything, just taking the floor. Launching into his own tangent, talking right over her.
Oh, yeah. That sounds familiar.
But here's the thing that really struck me. It wasn't just the interruption itself, which, we know that happens. The whole Manterruption thing, it's got a name now.
Right.
It was her reaction. She didn't fight back. She didn't say, "Excuse me, I'm not finished." Nothing. She just stopped, instantly.
Wow.
Muted her own mic, tilted her head a bit, and put on this, perfectly blank, professional, patient expression.
Yeah.
Just waited. He went on for nearly 2 minutes, basically just rephrasing her opening point, if I'm being honest. And when he finally finished, he gives this little nod, all right, your turn again.
Right. He granted her permission to continue her own presentation.
Exactly. And that immediate, practiced self-silencing, that flick of a switch from being the expert to just being the listener, it was so smooth, so obviously conditioned. It felt almost, ancient.
Yeah.
Like a gesture learned over centuries, just, happening right there in a modern boardroom.
That observation, that exact moment you described, the instant compliance, the self-silencing, that's precisely what we need to dig into today.
Right.
Our mission here, really, is to take that single instance, which might seem like just social awkwardness on the surface.
Or just one rude guy.
Exactly. And use it to investigate these deep-seated patriarchal dynamics. We have to move past just the observable interaction, the interruption, and get into the fundamental sociological and psychological architecture underneath it all.
Yeah, because we really want to understand why that response, that instantaneous conditioned reaction to, let's face it, a subtle power play, why is it so deeply ingrained? Why does that woman who, as I said, was clearly the expert, had all the data, why did she feel the need to just perform that self-silencing? It didn't feel like a choice she was making right then. It felt automatic.
Like a reflex.
Exactly, a reflex. And we need to try and measure the cost, right? The actual measurable cost to her, and maybe even to the company that, benefits from that silence in some weird way.
That's it. We're investigating how these long-standing patriarchal dynamics show up today as subtle, often invisible kinds of suppression in professional settings. Okay, so let's put that scene in context first. The subtlety of it, the interruption, then that immediate submission, it's really a perfect snapshot of how these old patriarchal power dynamics are still playing out right now in professional environments. And we're not talking here about the really obvious stuff, like legally defined harassment necessarily. We're looking at that constant sort of low-level flow of subtle suppression that just wears away at someone's agency over time.
Right. It's all those little things that happen day in, day out. Individually, you might brush them off, oh, he's having a bad day, or that's just his personality.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you see the pattern collectively, it paints this really devastating picture of systemic marginalization. And the research we're looking at confirms this, right? These subtle, gendered ways of suppressing people in the workplace are so common they actually have names now in professional circles, even legal ones.
They do.
Yeah.
You mentioned manterruptions, that act of interrupting a woman, often, to assert dominance or control the conversation, or even just take credit for her ideas.
Right. Undermining credibility in real time.
Precisely. And that's a common tool. Another term, which points to something maybe more severe, more like organizational exclusion, is placardization.
Placardization. Okay, what's that?
It basically describes the systemic ostracism or marginalization of someone within an organization. It's often a form of psychological violence, really pushing someone out without actually firing them. We'll probably come back to that one.
Okay. So these behaviors, manterrupting, placardization, they're like the visible symptoms of something deeper running underneath.
Exactly. They're symptoms of a much deeper structure.
So before we get into that structure, maybe we should just be super clear on the basic engine driving this. Let's define sexism, not just as, individual prejudice or bigotry, but as a system.
Yes, that's crucial. It's much broader than just individual bias. Sexism, systemically refers to the underlying beliefs, the ongoing behaviors, and the entrenched institutional practices that actively work together to protect and perpetuate gender inequality in society.
Right.
And critically, it does harm by exaggerating the differences, biological, social roles between men and women. And often it masks these differences, presenting them as just natural or unchangeable.
And when you structurally exaggerate those differences, you inevitably end up linking gender to status and power, don't you?
You do.
The result is a system where one gender just gets consistently favored and the other is structurally kind of positioned to defer, to step back.
Precisely. Within this framework, masculinity gets consistently associated with power, with high status, with superiority. Basically, the assumed right to, take the floor, dictate how things go. And conversely, femininity tends to be related to a weaker position, politically, economically, socially. This structural positioning where one gender is seen as inherently weaker or less authoritative, that's systemic sexism.
And while we should acknowledge, sexism can impact anyone, like men facing bias in fields like early education.
Absolutely. That's important.
The overwhelming way it manifests, the pervasive pattern, is still directed against women.
That's what the broad data shows, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the system is set up to link competence, authority, the right to speak with men. But that still doesn't quite explain the instant, almost invisible compliance we saw in that meeting. If she's the expert, why didn't she fight back, even just verbally?
Right.
This feels like it moves us beyond just rudeness into something more structural, some kind of theory.
It does. And this is exactly where we need to bring in the work of the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and specifically his concept of symbolic violence.
Yeah.
This theory is really the essential link, I think, between that big global structure and an individual's conditioned, almost automatic response.
Okay, symbolic violence. Let's unpack that, because violence usually makes you think of physical harm, right? Injury, force. But what I saw was done with, like a polite nod and a blank face. Right. No physical threat at all.
Exactly. And that's why symbolic violence is so insidious. It's defined as a subtle, non-physical form of violence exercised on a social agent with his complicity.
With his complicity. So the person it's happening to is involved.
Involved in the sense that they accept it, or at least don't overtly resist it. It operates through these shared, often unspoken, and frequently unrecognized assumptions about who deserves power and who should defer. And here's the absolutely crucial part about symbolic violence, according to Bourdieu. It's considered the most economic form of domination.
Economic. That's a really interesting word choice there. How is something so subtle, so psychological, also the most economically efficient?
Well, think about it. It's economic because it respects the economy of the system. It's cheap. Normal domination, overt domination, usually requires constant effort.
Right, like physical force or threats or constant monitoring by managers, rules.
Exactly. Policing.
Yeah.
Symbolic violence. It needs none of that. It works by compelling compliance internally. This means the dominated party, the woman in your story, essentially grants adhesion to the dominant party, the interrupting executive, without the dominant person needing to lift a finger, spend any energy, or use any resources to enforce it.
Wow. So the system basically gets free labor in the form of self-regulation. The guy who interrupted saves time and effort because the woman automatically adjusts her own behavior to keep the status quo going.
Precisely. Think of the cost saved. Not just for him, but for HR, for management. If she had fought back, insisted on her right to speak.
It would create conflict.
Right. Conflict requires intervention, maybe an HR review, documentation, meetings, a huge drain on time and emotional energy for everyone involved.
Yeah.
By instantly silencing herself, she performed the desired behavior, maintaining his dominance, avoiding conflict at absolute zero cost to him or the system he represents.
Okay, that's the key connection then. She automatically managed the conflict out of existence, which makes the whole system incredibly efficient at just maintaining that power imbalance. But why does she grant this adhesion? Why doesn't she recognize it as, violence or an illegitimate power grab?
Because, and this is the core of the theory, the only tools she has available to understand or interpret that relationship are the tools provided by the very system she's operating within.
So the system defines the terms of understanding itself.
Exactly. The system implicitly dictates that, in that context, the executive has the right to interrupt, or at least that his interruption isn't fundamentally illegitimate. She lacks the shared social language, the framework, to interpret that interruption clearly as an act of aggression or an illegitimate use of power.
So when you interpret the relationship of domination using the very rules that created the domination in the first place, the unequal relationship just looks natural, or normal.
Perfectly put. The interruption stops being seen as an aggressive power move and just gets filed under the way things are done here.
Okay, so her silence isn't a character flaw. It's not a lack of assertiveness. It's actually a conditioned response. It comes from using the system's own bias toolkit to make sense of the situation.
She's behaving, in a way, rationally, within an irrational, unequal framework that she's internalized over time.
All right, so if symbolic violence is this invisible rule book that makes inequality look normal, where does it actually live? Does it exist in specific places where power is constantly being negotiated?
It does. It resides in what Bourdieu called the field of power. Fields are basically structured arenas of conflict and interaction. Think of the corporate boardroom, a department's hierarchy, the legal profession, academia, any structured social space.
Okay.
And within these fields, your actions are heavily constrained by your position, by established roles. You act based on your role manager, employee, subordinate, or crucially for this discussion, your perceived gender role within that field.
So the instructions of that field, the unwritten rules, the history of who gets ahead, the hierarchies, they determine what's allowed and what's seen as stepping out of line. So when the woman got interrupted, she was instantly, maybe unconsciously, reminded of her effective position in that particular power field, regardless of her formal title or the fact she was presenting the data.
Exactly. And this symbolic power holds its sway through a kind of a dual mechanism that really relies on things being a bit opaque. First, misrecognition, and second, doxa.
Okay, misrecognition and doxa. Let's break those down. Misrecognition first.
Symbolic violence might initially be misrecognized by the person experiencing it. The first time someone interrupts you like that, you might just think it's awkward or rude. Maybe that person's just having an off day.
Right. You don't immediately label it as like a political act of domination.
Not usually, no. Not until it's repeated and it becomes normalized and eventually internalized.
So the gradual normalization is key for the system to work smoothly. The first interruption might feel jarring, make you think consciously about it. But by the 10th time...
By the 10th time, the instant self-muting becomes the automatic reflexive defense. The abnormal has become routine.
Okay. And that ties into the second term, doxa.
Yes, doxa. Doxa refers to the fundamental, really deep-seated, often unconscious principles that define what actions are considered legitimate or permissible within that specific field. They're the unwritten, unspoken rules that everyone operating in that field just accepts without question.
Like the bedrock assumptions.
Exactly. And this includes defining things like who has the right to speak, who's allowed to interrupt whom, how challenges to authority are dealt with. When the doxa is accepted unconsciously by pretty much everyone in the field, the domination becomes self-sustaining, becomes invisible.
Can you give maybe a concrete example of boardroom doxa that might lead to that kind of self-silencing?
Sure. Think about simple protocols that seem necessary but might disadvantage certain people. Like the doxa might dictate that only the highest-ranking person in the room can just cut off a discussion, regardless of the agenda.
Okay.
Or it might establish certain unspoken rules about eye contact, who's expected to look at whom, who holds the gaze. In a more patriarchal corporate setting, the doxa often includes the expectation that, say, enthusiasm or strong assertiveness from a woman gets read as emotional or aggressive.
While the exact same behavior from a man is seen as leadership or passion.
Precisely. These unwritten rules become the internal laws you have to follow to signal that you're competent, that you belong, that you understand how things really work.
And if you violate that doxa, even if you're technically correct or have the higher ground on substance, you risk being pushed out, ostracized.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the other people in the room. What about all the witnesses, the colleagues who saw the interruption, saw her silence herself? Do they play a role in cementing this whole structure?
Yeah, what about them?
They are absolutely critical legitimizers. You really can't overstate the role of witnesses, those coworkers who see the interruption or maybe other forms of subtle bullying or suppression, and they stay silent.
Even if they disagree with it.
Even if they disagree. They stay silent often out of fear, right? Fear of being targeted themselves if they speak up. But their silence ends up legitimizing the prevailing social order. It sends a powerful message. Challenging the established doxa is dangerous.
So their silence, regardless of where they sit on the official org chart, basically confirms that these unequal rules are the actual rules you have to follow to survive there. It's like a kind of corporate code of silence that reinforces the dominant structure.
Exactly, like an omerta, as you say. Now, this forces us to go even deeper into the individual experience. How does this field, with its rules and its doxa, actually get written into the person? If doxa is the external law, then the internal operating system has to be this concept Bourdieu called habitus.
Right, habitus. Let's focus on that because this seems like the mechanism that explains that instantaneous reaction, the reflex.
Habitus is the internalization mechanism. It's the internal, mostly unconscious way we perceive the world, evaluate situations, and then act within the structures of whatever field we're in. Think of it as a set of deeply ingrained dispositions, or like a highly refined muscle memory for social situations.
Okay.
It's described as a structuring principle. It's structured by our past experiences in the field, and it structures our present actions. It generates the unconscious strategies we use to navigate and adjust to those external structures. It basically translates what is necessary externally into what feels natural internally.
So, going back to the woman in the meeting, she didn't consciously sit there and weigh the pros and cons. Should I mute my mic or should I fight back? Her habitus just generated that self-silencing strategy instantly.
Correct.
Because her prior socialization, her experiences in similar fields had trained her unconsciously to adjust to that specific kind of power dynamic in that specific way. It's the psychological bit that makes these unequal relationships feel natural, even inevitable.
And when we apply this specifically to gender, we arrive at the concept of gender habitus. This really addresses how women, in particular, internalize gendered expectations that are often intrinsically linked to their historical position within the social structure. Historically, a lot of this gender habitus was connected to the domestic sphere, right?
Yeah.
Expectations around nurturing, deference, prioritizing the needs of others.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on that a little bit. The woman I described, she was in a high-powered corporate boardroom dealing with finance, high-level job, clearly the expert on the topic. There's nothing domestic about her professional role there at all. So is gender habitus, if it's rooted in domestic sphere expectations, really robust enough to explain how a professional woman in a modern, high-stakes financial firm internalizes these deferential beliefs? How does that connection work today?
That's an excellent question and a really necessary challenge. That tension is absolutely real, and it's something scholars engaging with Bourdieu definitely address. The key insight is that when women enter the public world, like the corporate world, that entry often fails to completely transform or overwrite this pre-existing sexual habitus. Instead, the public field, the corporation in this case, often ends up leveraging or exploiting those pre-existing, deeply incorporated aspects of gender socialization.
So the corporation doesn't actually have to train women to defer in certain situations. The underlying training, the habitus, is sort of already there from broader society?
In many ways, yes. That ingrained habitus, the learned expectation of deference, the tendency to prioritize others' needs, the strategy of managing conflict by withdrawing it, clashes fundamentally with the explicit professional expectation of assertion, of leadership, of taking charge.
Right.
So this structural conditioning means that even if she's brilliant, even if she's leading a multi-million-dollar presentation, the residue of that gender habitus can still generate self-silencing and compliance as the automatic, low-cost, perceived survival strategy when directly challenged by male authority.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. The workplace structure demands competence and assertiveness, but the deep-seated habitus generates compliance when challenged in that specific way. It puts the individual in this constant state of, cognitive dissonance, a bind.
A bind is a good way to put it. And this leads us straight to the ultimate price of complicity and why this pattern persists, especially in today's competitive, often precarious neoliberal corporate world. Symbolic power, remember, only really holds sway when individuals fear losing their job, their economic security.
More than they fear losing their dignity or self-respect in that moment.
Exactly. In environments where job security feels fragile, the threat of economic loss is an incredibly powerful lever.
The fear of being sidelined, of becoming placardisé, ostracized, pushed out of the field, is often enough to ensure people toe the line.
It is. And so mental pressures become the main tool. They're used by the dominant players to impose their views, maintain control, without resorting to brute force. It is, as we said earlier, the cheapest, most efficient form of control.
And the cost isn't just stress. It's the conscious or maybe unconscious suppression of your own voice, your own desires, just to survive professionally.
The individual is effectively forced to internalize the system's demands, reframing them as their own necessary choices for self-preservation.
Okay, so we've laid out the sociological framework, the rules of the game, the symbolic violence, and the concept of habitus that forces individuals to adjust internally. Now, let's zoom right in on the individual psychological cost. That practice self-silencing, we started with that. Behavior seems like a direct manifestation of something called internalized sexism.
Yes, this is where we see the internal injury, the psychological consequence. Internalized sexism is essentially the process where women absorb and then direct sexist beliefs and attitudes towards themselves or sometimes towards other women.
So it stems from absorbing that ingrained systemic belief that maybe they don't inherently deserve equal rights or aren't as competent or shouldn't have as much authority.
Precisely. So instead of directing the fight outwards against the external system that's imposing these beliefs,
the internal system turns against the self.
Exactly. The sexism is internalized.
So in that meeting, instead of asserting her expertise, the woman performed a kind of self-sacrifice as a defense mechanism.
That's a very accurate way to describe it. Internalized self-sacrifice becomes a defensive strategy. It's often used to avoid stigmatization, the fear of being labeled difficult, abrasive, not a team player.
All those labels.
All those labels. But the ultimate outcome of constantly deploying that strategy is often a profound loss of self. And this seems to be the core mental state we're trying to grasp here. That internal struggle to even know or assert your own desires, because your internal value system has been subtly rewired to prioritize the needs, wishes, and assertions of others, especially those perceived to be in the dominant group.
Wow. That sounds like a really painful and complicated psychological state. The fact that researchers have actually managed to quantify this, to measure it, means we can start putting some data behind the emotional weight of that boardroom moment.
That is the real power of the research in this area, yes. Studies have identified and confirmed 5 specific subscales or components that make up the broader construct of internalized sexism. And looking at these measurements helps us see exactly which beliefs are the most damaging, which ones are most central to the whole phenomenon.
Okay, let's dive into those. Where should we start? Maybe with the one that seems most directly connected to the power dynamic. We observe that instant prioritizing of the male executive's voice over her own expertise.
Let's start right there, because statistically, it's the most significant factor. The first subscale is male prioritization. And get this single component had the highest association with overall internalized sexism. It explained a massive 77% of the total variance in the scale measuring internalized sexism.
77%?
77%. And its statistical signature, what researchers call the path coefficient, was a staggering 0.88. That makes it, by far, the most significant engine driving the entire framework of internalized sexism.
Okay, 77% variance explained just by male prioritization. That feels like definitive proof that prioritizing men's authority, their voice, their objectives, isn't just a part of internalized sexism, it's the absolute core mechanism. It's not primarily about women hating other women, it's about deferring to perceived male power.
That's what the data strongly suggests. This subscale centers on beliefs about prioritizing men in decision-making, automatically deferring to their authority, constantly seeking their approval, maybe even unconsciously. The core internalized message seems to be men's voices, their judgment, their objectives, are somehow inherently more valuable or more worthy of attention than my own.
Right.
And that incredibly high correlation, that 0.88 path coefficient, suggests this deference isn't just a side effect. It seems to be the fundamental structure upon which all the other forms of internalized sexism tend to rely.
And this is what causes that instant self-silencing when a male voice jumps in to take over. The automatic conditioned response is driven by this deeply ingrained need to prioritize his assertion over her own continuation. It's like she's acting out that 77% variance right there in the meeting.
Precisely. It's the behavioral manifestation of that core belief. Now, the second major factor identified is directly tied to the consequence of that compliance. It's about the internal price that gets paid. This subscale is called loss of self-internalized powerlessness.
Okay.
This really gets to the core mental state that generates the self-silencing, because the individual has, over time, internalized a sense of their own powerlessness and struggles profoundly to even identify, let alone assert, their own desires or needs.
This sounds like the scale that would capture the real emotional toll, that feeling of being constantly off balance in your own life, maybe not even knowing what you truly want. What specific feelings or thoughts define this, and how strong is its statistical connection?
The items used to measure this really illustrate that profound mental compromise. For instance, one statement focused on feeling difficult to know what I want myself as I focus on fulfilling the wishes of others. That specific feeling carried a high factor loading of 0.69.
0.69, that's high.
It is. And that 0.69 isn't just a number. You can think of it as the statistical signature of personal erosion. It means that the feeling of having your internal compass sort of broken, being unable to distinguish your own needs from the constant demands or expectations of others, is powerfully tied to this sense of internalized powerlessness.
The person is constantly living through other people's wishes. That must take a huge amount of mental energy that's diverted away from their own goals or even just their work.
Absolutely. And another critical item here is the feeling of guilt. Feeling guilty when I give priority to my own wishes and needs over anything else. This had a factor loading of 0.64.
Guilt for prioritizing yourself.
Yes. That guilt factor is particularly striking, isn't it? It suggests that for someone high on this scale, asserting yourself, taking up space, prioritizing your own agenda, things often necessary for professional success, actually feels like a moral failing, like an act of selfishness, rather than a legitimate right or requirement.
Wow. And in a professional context, like the boardroom, this internalized powerlessness can show up even when someone has clear evidence of their own skill, right? There was something about competence.
Yes, exactly. The most painful piece of data here, perhaps, relates to that competence gap. Another illustrative item, directly relevant to the boredom experience, is the feeling that even if more educated and experienced, I do not feel as competent as the men around me.
Despite the evidence.
Despite the objective evidence. This item had a factor loading of 0.43. Now that's lower than the others we mentioned, but it's still significant. It demonstrates how objective reality, being the expert, having the data, being more qualified, can be completely overridden by this internalized belief in your own inferiority relative to the men in the room.
So, the woman in my anecdote, brilliant, data-driven, was likely fighting this internal script, telling her she wasn't really as competent as the man who just interrupted and basically took over her presentation. All thanks to this feeling of internalized powerlessness.
It's highly likely that belief system was active. And remember that internalized powerlessness is generated and sustained primarily by the deeper need for male prioritization. Should we quickly touch on the other three factors?
Yeah, let's round them out. The next one was derogation, I think.
Yes, derogation.
That sounds like maybe a survival tactic, like judging other women harshly to try and elevate your own position within that patriarchal field.
That's exactly what it captures. This component involves making high judgments, using negative labels, or even directing aggressive comments towards other women. It often functions as a mechanism to position oneself as more ideal or somehow more deserving of acceptance or power within the dominant male-defined system. And this subscale also showed a pretty high association with internalized sexism overall, explaining 73% of the variance, with a path coefficient of 0.85. So clearly an important coping strategy, however damaging.
Right, the whole I'm not like other girls kind of phenomenon where women sometimes police each other to gain favor in a male-dominated structure, which again helps maintain the system without the dominant group even having to do anything.
Precisely. It outsources the policing. Then there's self-objectification.
Okay, that sounds like focusing on appearance.
Entirely.
Yeah.
It's about focusing on external validation, where a woman's worth gets implicitly or explicitly limited to her physical appearance, her bodily image. This can include feeling pressure to engage in costly or time-consuming practices, cosmetics, fashion, aesthetic surgery, purely to gain external approval and conform to often impossible cultural standards of beauty.
And the psychological fallout if you feel you don't meet those standards or don't get that external approval must be pretty severe.
It can be, yes. Failure to secure that approval, which is often a constantly moving target anyway, can definitely lead to serious psychological consequences. Anxiety, depression, body shaming, eating disorders. It fundamentally shifts the focus away from intrinsic worth or professional value towards superficial compliance.
Okay. And the fifth one, you said it was the least influential.
Yes, the fifth and final component identified was competition self-separation. This involves actively trying to present oneself as superior to or more ideal than other women, sometimes by actively demeaning or belittling them in a directly competitive way. You could see it as the competitive action related to the judgmental attitude of derogation.
Okay.
But interestingly, as you noted, this subscale had by far the lowest association with the overall measure of internalized sexism. It explained only about 9% of the variance, with a path coefficient of just 0.31.
That statistical difference feels really important. It tells us that while, yes, women might compete or sometimes belittle each other, the real foundational engine of internalized sexism isn't that competition. It's the prioritizing of male power, that massive 77% variance, and the profound sense of personal powerlessness that results from it.
That seems to be the key takeaway from this research, yes.
So the self-silencing we saw isn't just a moment of low confidence or a choice of humility. It's the direct enactment of an internalized belief structure, a structure designed, maybe tragically, for professional and psychological survival within an unequal system.
The self-silencing in that boardroom was likely the consequence of that individual unconsciously maximizing her chances of survival within a system that consistently structurally prioritizes the male voice, even if doing so means sacrificing her own competence and dignity in that moment.
Okay, we've really established the internal injury, the psychological cost of this internalization. But now we need to zoom back out because this individual compromise, the self-silencing, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It happens inside a corporate machine, a system that might actually benefit from or at least tolerate that insecurity.
Exactly.
We started with what looked like an individual act of cruelty, the Manterruption, but the entire system itself can become cruel. Let's talk about the systemic cruelty that maybe feeds this habitus, makes it necessary.
Yes, that's the essential transition we need to make now to understanding systemic violence. This is different from individual acts. Systemic violence occurs when the entire organization, not just one bad manager or one interrupting executive, becomes the perpetrator.
The system itself is violent.
In a psychological sense, yes. And this form of systemic cruelty is often driven by the relentless demands of neoliberalism, the constant pressure for continuous, quantifiable performance improvement. The philosophy of homo economicus, where everyone is just a rational economic actor maximizing their utility to achieve its ends, profit, efficiency, market share. The organization as a system sometimes ends up destroying individuals.
That unrelenting focus on performance metrics, the belief that everything can and should be measured and optimized, it creates this incredibly high-pressure, competitive, stressful, and often uncertain environment. Constant output is demanded, often leading to completely unrealistic expectations.
Precisely. And when that homo economicus philosophy dictates that the ends justify the means, that profit and efficiency are the only metrics that truly matter, then the entire enterprise can morph into a system of psychological violence. And the cruelty within this kind of environment can be incredibly subtle. It might not be shouting or overt threats. It might be things like lies, contempt, and the use of paradox.
Use of paradox, like what?
Like demanding contradictory things simultaneously. Be innovative, but don't make mistakes. Take initiative, but always get approval first. It creates impossible binds. It's the constant, subtle undermining of people's self-worth, often disguised as rigorous performance management or tough love.
So the performance demands create the instability and stress. And then these subtle cruelties are used to manage people's reactions and extract compliance. This must tie into those more extreme forms of suppression we mentioned earlier, like placardization. That sounds like the ultimate corporate betrayal.
The placardization is indeed a specific and quite extreme form of organizational exclusion. You can think of it as a formalized, structural kind of psychological violence. It's where individuals are deliberately, systematically ostracized and marginalized within the organization.
Why? What triggers it?
Usually because they're deemed incompatible with the organization's relentless demands. Maybe they aren't hitting impossible targets, or maybe they're seen as too expensive, too old, or critically, because they've been perceived as rebellious.
And rebellious could just mean asserting themselves or refusing to do something unethical.
Often, yes. Simply refusing to participate in behavior they see as unethical or questioning the dominant way of doing things, they become symbolically exiled within the company.
How does placardization actually work in practice? It's not just getting fired, you said.
No, it's usually designed to be a slower, more psychologically damaging process. The organization starts by stripping away all meaningful work and resources from the person.
Okay.
They might find their key responsibilities suddenly redistributed to more junior staff. Or they might be assigned to some completely meaningless dead-end project, totally isolated from their team. It's often referred to in French workplaces, where the term originated, as being literally put in the closet or in the cupboard, hence placardization.
Wow.
They're isolated, their input is ignored, they're deliberately excluded from important meetings, from critical information flows, from decision-making processes they used to be part of.
So the target is just left completely isolated with maybe nothing to do, just the four walls of their office and this immense internal pressure building up until they just quit.
That's exactly the goal. The case of Catherine, which was detailed in some of the research we looked at, is a really clear illustration. She worked in HR, and apparently refused to follow orders from her boss to deliberately destabilize some of her colleagues' behavior that sounds like it was driven by the organization's own systemic cruelty.
So she refused to participate in the cruelty.
Right, and for that refusal, she herself was targeted by her boss, who then applied these exact same marginalization tactics to her. She wasn't fired outright, but she was systematically stripped of all professional relevance, all purpose within the company.
And what happened to her?
She was pushed into a serious psychological decline. She ended up having to take extended sick leave because the mental pressure was just overwhelming. While she was gone, her remaining work was reallocated. She described feeling completely jaded, powerless, used up.
That's brutal.
It is. Placardization is engineered to impose unbearable mental pressures until the individual leaves voluntarily, which effectively absolves the organization of responsibility, avoids severance packages, prevents lawsuits for unfair dismissal. It's the ultimate price for failing or refusing to conform to the field's dominant doxa.
And this kind of organizational cruelty is often enabled, or at least not stopped, by institutional complicity, right? Or what experts call secondary victimization. This is when the very institutions that are supposed to help, like HR, senior management, maybe even legal systems or unions, actually end up making the problem worse for the victim.
Yes, secondary victimization is a critical concept here. It's defined as the victimization that occurs not from the primary harmful act itself, not from the Manterruption or the placardization, but through the response of institutions and individuals to the victim.
So it's how the system responds after the fact.
Exactly. And that institutional response is often characterized by things like skepticism, disbelief, minimizing the harm, maybe a lack of recognition that an injury even occurred, or sometimes even outright blaming the victim.
So if the woman in my anecdote, say, after experiencing a pattern of this kind of abuse or exclusion, finally went to HR to report it, and HR responded by minimizing it, calling it a personality clash, or asking her what she did to provoke the interruptions, that would be secondary victimization.
That is a perfect example, yes. The individual seeks validation, seeks confirmation that what happened was wrong, but the supposed neutral institutions end up implicitly or explicitly confirming that the original domination was somehow normal, acceptable, or maybe even the victim's own fault.
And that must just destroy any trust the person had in those institutions.
It produces a profound and frankly justified distrust. People feel betrayed not once, but twice. First by the perpetrator, then by the system that was supposed to protect them.
Is there any data on how common this institutional distrust is? Does it happen often?
Well, some research conducted by networks that address violence against women found that a significant percentage of the women involved in their studies reported experiencing institutional victimization. In some cases, it was as high as 27% more than a quarter.
Wow.
And the report suggested it was often exacerbated when children were involved, perhaps due to skeptical or biased responses from social services or family courts. The core issue is that the system is often designed to police itself, and part of that policing involves doubting or dismissing the claims made by the party perceived as weaker or subordinate.
It sounds like a completely self-confirming loop. The dominated person initially grants complicity because of the embedded system, the habitus, and then if they do try to break free and report it, the supposedly neutral institutions often just confirm that the original domination was, in fact, necessary or unavoidable.
It can certainly function that way, reinforcing the initial power imbalance. And frighteningly, this systemic bias isn't just staying within human interactions anymore. It's actually leaping beyond that and getting mathematically encoded into our technology. We really have to consider bias in the digital age, specifically how this whole patriarchal framework, these ingrained biases, are being reproduced by modern tools like artificial intelligence.
Wait, so the same biases that developed over centuries in places like boardrooms are literally being coded into the algorithms that we increasingly rely on every single day?
It seems so, yes. The underlying text corpora, those massive data sets of language used to train AI models like ChatGPT and others, they contain, as researchers put it, recoverable and accurate imprints of our historic biases.
So the data reflects the bias past.
Exactly. The data accurately reflects the historical status quo distribution of gender in relation to careers, social roles, even the kind of language typically associated with each gender. The AI isn't malicious. It simply learns the patterns, the historical doxa, embedded in the data it's fed.
Can you give some concrete examples? How does this linguistic bias or occupational bias actually show up in AI systems that people use?
There are several well-documented examples. First, think about predictive text or machine translation. AI systems frequently associate professions like engineer, CEO, surgeon, or doctor with male pronouns, while associating roles like nurse, assistant secretary, or teacher with female pronouns.
Because that reflects the historical statistics in the training data.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which ends up reinforcing the stereotype every time someone uses the tool.
Oh.
Second, we see it potentially happening in resume filtering software used by HR department.
Oh, right.
If a company has historically hired, say, 95% men for a particular high-status technical role, the AI, trained on past hiring data, might learn that male-associated keywords or background markers are predictors of a successful hire. It might then unconsciously penalize resumes that have female names or mention women's colleges or have gaps typically associated with childcare.
Even if the candidate is equally or more qualified based on skills and experience?
Exactly, because her profile doesn't statistically match the biased historical pattern of success. It effectively turns past bias into future company policy, and it automates systemic discrimination.
Making it seem objective because it's done by an algorithm.
That's the danger. And a third area is things like risk assessment or loan applications. If the historical data shows that women, on average, are less likely to hold certain types of high capital assets or might have different lifetime earning trajectories due to career interruptions, often linked to that gender habitus we discussed,
then the AI might assign a higher risk factor to a perfectly qualified woman applying for a loan.
It could, yes, simply because her demographic profile reflects an embedded structural disadvantage present in the data, not because of her individual creditworthiness or capability.
So the same system, the same set of underlying assumptions that told the woman in my meeting to instinctively self-silence, that system is now programming our machines to hold the exact same expectations and biases.
It appears to be. The biases become invisible again, hidden within complex algorithms, which makes them exponentially harder to identify and challenge because they're presented as neutral, objective, data-driven outputs.
It's like the patriarchal system is ensuring its own longevity by outsourcing its discriminatory worldview to the machines, embedding that corporate doxa deep into the fabric of the digital economy.
That's certainly one way to look at the potential long-term consequences, yes. #tag outro.
You know, we started this deep dive with that single, seemingly small moment, that instantaneous act of self-silencing in a corporate meeting. A subtle thing, easy to miss, maybe easy for some people to just dismiss as a minor blip, a lack of confidence perhaps. But what we've really uncovered here is that this apparently small gesture is actually just the visible tip of a truly massive psychological and sociological iceberg.
Absolutely. That conditioned behavior we've seen is fundamentally fueled by symbolic violence, that insidious mechanism where the unequal power relationship is constantly being reinforced, made to feel natural, even presented as economically necessary for the system to function smoothly.
And that mechanism gets codified inside the individual through the gender habitus, that unconscious operating system, that set of ingrained dispositions that forces the person to automatically adjust to the field's unequal structures, often without even realizing it.
Right. And the immediate, measurable psychological cost of making that constant adjustment seems to be that profound sense of internalized powerlessness, coupled with and driven by that overriding imperative of male prioritization, which, remember, the data showed was the single biggest engine driving internalized sexism, accounting for that huge 77% of the variance. Her internal life, in a way, gets reorganized around the necessity of deference.
Yeah. And the whole power imbalance just keeps going, it persists. Because the cognitive structures the dominated person uses to understand the situation, her belief, maybe unconscious, and the necessity of her silence align perfectly with the social structures of the dominant group, the unspoken corporate doxa that implicitly gave the man the unchallenged right to interrupt her in the first place.
It becomes a reinforcing cycle. And that cycle is then further cemented by the broader pressures of things like neoliberal systemic violence in the workplace, where relentless performance demands can justify organizational cruelty like placardization. And now, as we just discussed, it's even being extended into our automated world through biased AI systems.
The end result is this incredibly efficient, low-cost system of domination. It requires minimal overt effort from the dominant group because the dominated party, through internalized mechanisms, automatically administers much of the control herself.
The most effective systems of control, it seems, are always those that don't announce themselves as control. They pretend to merely describe the existing social reality, but in the very act of describing it based on biased assumptions. They actively prescribe and enforce a world where certain groups are conditioned to self-silence, to doubt their own competence, and to perpetually prioritize the needs, assertions, and authority of others.